Hey guys, Justin here with JHart Modelworks. It has been a while, but it is time to get some progress done on this Challenger. In this video, we're going to be focusing on the engine. I'm not going to lie, this could be a long video, as we have a ton of work to do. We're going to put a magnet in the air cleaner so that we can take the air cleaner off and put it back on again as we want, because under that giant air cleaner, we've got some fuel line work to do. We've got an attempt at some throttle linkage. I'm not the greatest at throttle linkage out there, but we're going to make an attempt. We've got a distributor and plug wires to run. We've got beautiful metal pulleys from Mark over at Off the Sprue. There is a ton of work. It's going to be a lot of fun. So you go get a cold beverage of choice, maybe some snacks. I'm going to get this camera flipped around and we're going to get started. Before we do anything else, we're going to start by getting the two halves of the engine and transmission block put together. We're going to go all the way around the seam with some Tamiya extra thin, and then we're just going to press the two pieces home and let that sit together and cure up. Our block and our heads are all going to be one color, and I like to get anything that's going to be one color glued up together first. So we're going to go ahead and throw some Tamiya extra thin on these heads, and we're going to glue them to our block as well. Now we're not gluing the intake on, we're just setting in place because the fit on a lot of these parts is pretty sloppy. So we're just going to hold that in place while we press the heads together so that they sit snug up against the intake. Now begins all the sanding. Now for the top up here, we're not trying to get it perfect, we're just trying to get it fairly smooth so that the intake will sit fairly flush to the engine block. With that done, we're going to turn our attention to this oil pan and the underside of the transmission. And this we do want to get perfectly smooth because this is the part that is most likely to be seen. Now I'm going to switch between a bunch of different tools. I am going to use the flat sanders as well as the sponge sanders from Display. And I even found that this was a really useful place for my little sanding tools that I made. I found that the flat sander was really good for working the upper section of the oil pan and the front of the bell housing, and the curved sander really let me get to that rounded edge and down into the gap between them. Now I've been asked a couple of times now, when are these coming out? And here's the situation. If I just sell the design files on Colts, then either only people with 3D printers can get them, or some part printer is going to get the designs and start selling them, and then they make a bunch of money while I only get a few bucks for the design files. I kind of want to print them myself and sell them myself, but my little printer can only print about 3 at a time, and it takes about an hour and a half per run. I thought about outsourcing the printing, but then the cost goes up and I have to make them more expensive. Then I also have to think about how am I going to sell them. eBay or Etsy will of course take a cut per sale, and then opening up my own website opens up a bunch of other expenses and complications. So I'm trying to work all this out and figure out the best way to go about it without turning into that guy that takes a bunch of orders and gets a bunch of people's money and can't get any product out and leaves everybody unhappy. Moving on, we need to drill all the holes for our spark plug wires. I picked up a cordless rotary tool from Amazon for about 10 or 15 bucks that goes down to around 3,000 RPM, hoping this would speed up drilling all these holes. It does make quicker work of them, and I also found that I broke fewer drill bits than manually drilling with a pin vise, but it still spins too fast and basically just melts through the plastic rather than drilling. I spent more time cleaning melted plastic off the drill bits than I did drilling the holes, so I still don't think this really works out. I'd like to find something that does around 500 to 1000 RPM, but still uses these 1/8 inch shank bits, so if you know of anything, let me know in the comments section. For drilling all the holes in the distributor, I found that it spun way too fast, so I went back to manually using the pin vise to drill the 9 holes out of the distributor cap. So I did 3D print the distributor, and I like to print a spare when I do small parts like this, just in case I mess something up. Next up, we're going to make alternator mounts. As you all know how much I hate floating alternators. The Dodge alternator has a mounting bracket with a post that bolts to the head from the back of the mounting bracket, so we're going to start by drilling the back of the alternator where that post should be. Once we have the hole drilled, we're going to glue in a piece of 0.5 mm metal rod. As always, guys, I want to remind you, I do speed my footage up, usually around double speed, just to kind of keep this from being too crazy long of a video, so take your time and be careful. Now we're not gluing the belts to the pulleys, we're just going to dry fit everything to get a good idea of where the alternator sits with the engine. Then we can drill a 1/2 millimeter hole into the head for the post to fit in. And a quick dry fit makes sure everything still lines up. From here we're going to go ahead and drill another hole into the block. Then we'll insert our 1/2 millimeter metal rod into the block and bend it over at a 90-degree angle. With the alternator reinserted, we want to make a mark on both the metal pin and on the alternator so we know where to cut the pin and where to drill the alternator. Now we can glue our second pin into place in the side of the alternator. Then before that glue can dry, we want to dry fit the alternator back into engine so that we know that the posts will line up correctly when it sets. Now we have a properly mounted alternator. Our next order of business is going to be to prepare the carburetors and the air cleaner. We want to start by sanding off the seam lines off the top and the bottom of the carburetor so it'll sit nice and smooth on the intake manifold. But we want to make sure we don't accidentally break or sand off the little locating nubs. There's 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom, and there's a larger one and a smaller one to help you locate it correctly and facing the right direction. Next, we need to drill a 2 millimeter wide hole about 1 millimeter deep, dead center in the top of the middle carb to hold a 2 millimeter magnet. So you really don't want to go that deep at all. This magnet needs to sit flush at the top. We're going to pull out some magnets and dry fit them into the hole and check our depth. Then we want to pull off just 2 magnets and again dry seat them so that one sticks out of the top, and test fit the air cleaner to make sure that it will sit correctly on top of the magnets. Now we're going to add a little bit of CA glue to the top magnet and clean off any excess. We're then going to sit the air cleaner on top of the magnets so that the top magnet glues to the bottom of the air cleaner. Next, after a quick check to make sure that our magnets didn't glue together, we're going to put a little bit of CA glue into the hole in the carburetor. Then we're going to reseat the air cleaner, and we want to make absolutely certain that the magnet goes into the hole and glues into the carburetor. Voila! Matching, perfectly aligned magnets. Now to add a little extra structural integrity to this top magnet, we're going to add some CA glue all the way around it. We don't want to get any on top of it, but we do want to get it all the way around and just let that dry into place. We want to give that an hour or so to cure and harden up properly. Then we'll sand the CA glue to make sure that it's flush with the magnet and isn't going to cause any interference issues when we seat the air cleaner. The headers have a ton of flash that needs to be cleaned up so that it won't interfere with our plug wires, and then we want to sand the seam line smooth on the end of the headers. We can then drill a 1/2 millimeter hole in them and glue in some metal rod into the end of the exhaust headers. This will give us a good way to mount them for painting, and later when we go to do the chassis work, we can cut them down short and use them as locating pins for the exhaust pipes. And the last thing we're going to do is drill 2 holes for our heater hoses. I don't get these in the exact correct location, but they're close enough. Alright, so our engine is painted up and we've got the valve covers already on. I'm not going to show that again. If you look at my last video where I cover the valve covers, I show that being installed. I'm really happy with those valve covers, but we do see we have our engine in Hemi Orange, and I've seen several times on Facebook groups as well as some of the web forums questions on how to mix Hemi Orange, sometimes specifically with Tamiya paints. Now that's a trick question because as you can see here, there are two different Hemi Oranges. The one on the left is Race Hemi Orange. It's kind of a yellowy orange, and my understanding is this was used on race engines early to mid 60s. The one on the right, which is darker, is Street Hemi Orange. That's what we're using here. It was used on all the road cars as well as some of the later race engines. I found to get the color that I've got here, what I did was I mixed about 7 drops of Tamiya's Pure Red to 1 milliliter of Tamiya's Pure Orange. Now for the race engine orange, I found that I needed 3 parts Tamiya Pure Yellow to 1 part Tamiya Pure Orange. So if you're looking to try and, figure out how to mix this yourself, that's the ratios that I used that got me good looking results. We're going to start with basic assembly and gluing on the intake manifold. We're going to put some glue on the top, and then without gluing the distributor, we're going to mount that into place just to make sure that everything lines up correctly and we can get the distributor back in later. Next, we're going to mount our alternator, and we're going to mount it in so that both pins are in their respective holes, but we don't want to push it all the way in. Once we do have the pins in place, we're going to come back in with a bit of CA glue, and we're just going to apply a tiny bit to the metal posts right before we slide them all the way into position. Sticking with the top, we're going to go ahead and glue our carbs in place. Like I mentioned during prep, there's a small pin and a large pin. The large pin goes towards the back. So the kit does not come with an oil filter. I went ahead and 3D printed one from one of the Motorboss engines, so we're going to go ahead and cut that off the supports and sand that smooth. We're then going to drill a 0.5 millimeter hole into the connecting side of the oil filter, and we're going to put a metal pin in here. This way it's going to hold a lot stronger when we put it in the engine, and it's not going to get broken off as we're handling things because it's just press fit. With the metal pin in place, we're going to poke a small hole through this orange paint, and that's going to show us where we want to drill another 0.5 millimeter hole so that we can locate the oil filter. I'll put a little CA glue on the metal pin, and we'll just slide that into place. We got a little bit of detail painting to do. We're going to use a little bit of Vallejo gunmetal and some Vallejo silver, and we're going to paint up the fuel pump that's down here on the bottom front corner, and that's going to break this up a little bit and will give us a little bit of extra detail. Now I kind of wish during prep that I had cut and carved out the fuel pump a little better to give it a little bit more definition. I did the starter, but I forgot to record it. And so far, our engine is looking pretty good. The air cleaner needs a little bit more love, and we're going to start with some decals. We have our big 340 6-pack decal to go on the center. We want to make sure we get this nice and straight. I lost my Tamiya decal tweezers a little while ago. These are a set of Hosan P40J soft tip tweezers meant for doing electronics work. I also use a set of black ones. They're hard anti-static. These are soft and rubber tipped. They're non-slip. They do a great job of holding the parts as well as working decals. I find they have a little bit of pull to them, and they don't scrape across and cut into your decals like metal tweezers can. Now these are not cheap. We're talking $27 for a pair of tweezers. So I'm not sponsored. I had to pay out of pocket for these, and I'm not pushing them, but I do think they are a great tool investment for the hobby. So if you've got the money, and I know nobody really has the money anymore, but if you've got the money, they're not a bad idea to pick up a pair. These are awesome for decals and tiny parts. We have 2 more decals to go on here. They're too small to read, but I'm pretty sure there's some kind of a warning label because they're bright yellow. So we're going to put one above this wing nut and the second one goes below it. And then we're going to use a little bit of Vallejo silver and our mechanical pencil, and we're just going to come in here and detail paint the wing nuts for the top. Now, before we add a lot of fragile detail, we want to go in and add a wash to the engine, and I like to use 3. We're going to start by applying some Tamiya black panel liner over the entire engine. We want to get into all those little nooks and crannies and highlight all that detail, but at the same time we also want to hit these big flat areas too. This is an enamel wash and it's going to stain the paint slightly even after we remove it, and that's going to help tone down that orange a little because I probably should have sprayed that over a light gray instead of a white primer. It's a bit bright. Now once it's had a chance to dry, we're going to come back in with some odorless mineral spirits and some cotton buds. We're probably going to use several. And we're just going to come in here and we're going to remove all the excess panel liner off of all the big flat surfaces and the raised areas. And that's going to create a lot of shadows for us because scaled down, the shadows don't quite look right on these small parts without a wash. With the black panel line wash done, we're going to move on to Tamiya's brown, and this is kind of an orangey brown. I'm going to keep this focused to under the valve covers and kind of around the oil pan. We're not going to go crazy with this and go everywhere with it. Now, just like with the black, we're going to come in with some odorless mineral spirits on a cotton bud, and we're going to clean this up as well, but you're going to start to see kind of an orangey brown in some areas. It may look a little odd, but we're not done yet. For our third and final wash, we're using Tamiya's dark brown, and we're going to focus on pretty much the same areas. Under those valve covers, around the oil pan, the kinds of places you might see oil leaks or, maybe make a little mess while you're doing some maintenance. For instance, we definitely want to make sure we get some around and underneath that oil filter. We're going to do one more round of cleanup with the odorless mineral spirits, and then we're going to move on and do the air cleaner. Now with the air cleaner, we're going to use the exact same process. We're going to apply some panel liner, clean it up with the Q-tips, but we're only going to use the black here as this isn't a part that's likely to get oily. Now the panel liner did get a little abusive with our silver paint on the wing nuts up here, so we are going to go back and touch that up with some more Vallejo silver. And with this quick before and after shot, you can clearly see the difference that those washes are going to make. Alright, with that out of the way, we're going to start wiring up our distributor using some Protect spark plug wire and some Protect spark plug boots. Now we're going to cut one of these spark plug boots into thirds for the distributor because these need to be pretty short. And with a lot of fiddling, we're going to slide one of those thirds onto our spark plug wire. Next, we're going to strip off a very short segment of the insulation. We're going to dip that end into some super glue, and we will very carefully put this into place in our distributor. Now, before that can dry, we want to grab that small piece of boot and we're going to push it down onto the distributor into the glue. So that first one went right in the middle, and that was for our ignition coil. Now we're going to do about 8 more of these on the outside. We're just going to repeat that same process. But after we get this first one in place, we're going to dry fit the distributor into the engine, and we're going to measure this first wire all the way down to our longest possible run, and we're going to cut it off there. And this is going to give us a guide for how long we should cut the rest of our wires. Now we want to leave a little extra to make sure that we can get this into the plug hole, and then we're going to repeat that process using that length as our guide for the next 7 plug wires. For a V8 engine, we're going to have a total of 9 wires, and once we get them all done, we're going to add a little bit of glue into the mounting hole, and we're going to slide the distributor in place, making sure we get it lined up properly. That blackish bluish thing you see me cutting on is a glass bathroom tile from Home Depot. This was like all of maybe $3 and it is awesome for cutting photo etch. Speaking of photo etch, we are going to be using the ProTech wire looms, but before we do, we want to go ahead and pull all of our spark plugs into the correct sides because we're going to be wiring this up into order. We have a really cleanly run distributor. We can see each and every wire in its position. We might as well do this right. Once we get our plug wires to each correct side, the next thing we want to do is get them in order into a 4-port photo etch wire loom. This is going to get them in order and keep them in order, and it's going to make all of our wiring look really neat and tidy. Once we have all the wires in, we want to slide the wire loom down towards the distributor, but not all the way to it. We pretty much want it to sit right around the top of the valve cover. We also want to make sure that we're leaving a little wire so that our wires can be bent smoothly and pressed down along the top of the engine. We want them to flow down the distributor and drape over the engine and the valve cover. We're trying to create the illusion of gravity pulling down on the plugs. Plug wires typically do not run in sharp, straight lines from the distributor to the plugs. Once we have the wire loom where we want it, we're going to take some CA glue and we're going to apply it to the underside of the spark plug wires right up against that wire loom so that the glue isn't visible when you're looking at the engine. We're going to repeat this process on the opposite side, and since the distributor sits kind of off center and is farther from this side, we're going to add 2 4-port wire looms to this side with the second one ending at or real close to the valve cover. And don't forget, we want our wires to drop and run across and lay on the engine and not just shoot straight over to the valve cover. The plugs on this 340 run in pairs that go in between the exhaust headers. So we're going to add a 2-port wire loom to the first pair and we're going to slide it into place. We want this one to sit below the valve cover, kind of close to where our plug holes are, and we'll again add our glue to the back side of the wires to hold the loom in place. Once the wire loom is in place, we want to cut the wire to fit, add a little glue to the hole, and then slide the wires into the plug holes. I cut these a little short. It almost didn't fit, but there was just enough there to make this one work. This is a long section in a long video. I'm not going to make you sit through all 8 of these plug wires. We're just going to repeat the same process. Add a loom, glue it into place, trim the wires, and glue them in the holes. Now that our plugs are in, we can glue on our exhaust headers, and we want to make sure that the plug wires stay clear of the exhausts. There is no real positive locating for these, and the fit on them is really sloppy. A test fit with the exhaust pipe suggests that you want to make sure the pipes go straight down, they don't lean into the engine or lean out away from it. Now you probably noticed I didn't use plug boots on the plugs like I normally do. The fit on these headers is pretty bad. There's not a lot of clearance between them and the engine for the plug wires, and the driver's side is even worse than this one. So I'm pretty sure the boots would have caused interference, so I'm just going to paint them on with a Sharpie marker. Using some 3D models of some T-fittings and 90 and 45 degree angle joints, I cobbled together a fuel rail and printed it up, and now we're going to carefully cut these off the, I guess we'll just touch them and they'll fall off. Well, we'll just add a little CA glue to all 3 of these tips, and they should line up perfectly with each of the 3 carburetors. I didn't do any drilling or any of that. These are just press fit right up against the sides. which is why I wanted to do all that other stuff first, because these could be very easily just knocked off. Something new I wanted to try was a fuel filter. These are some really small diodes I picked up off Amazon. There's like 100 of these for $7. I kind of like that orange color in there. We're going to take one of these out and we're going to line it up where we want it, and then we're going to make some measurements, mark it, bend it a few times, just to run it down to the bottom of the fuel pump and make sure that it sits nicely. When we get to the bottom here, we want to mark it at the fuel filter. We're going to bend it so that it runs back up, and we're going to trim it off. We're then going to drill a hole in the bottom of the fuel pump here to fit the lead. Now we want to mark and bend it at the top so that it lines up with our fuel rail. We're going to slide the fuel filter most of the way into the fuel pump. We're going to add a little bit of CA glue to the end of the lead and then slide it the rest of the way in place. With that done, we're going to cut the top end lead where it lines up to the fuel rail, being careful not to hit and break it off. And then we'll just glue it and butt it up against the fuel rail so that it glues into place. Now for a last little bit of detail, I'm going to take a little bit of Vallejo silver and I'm going to run just a slight bead of silver across the top where the black bit is. I kind of want to leave that orange because it looks kind of like fuel in that fuel filter. Shh, don't tell Carol, but we're going to steal a staple from her stapler. We're going to trim the ends off the staple so the bar will sit close to the carbs. Don't lose the ends though, we need at least one of them later, and these things hurt if you step on them. Next, we'll put some glue on the ends of the staple and we're going to glue it up against the carburetors. I guess I could have drilled these for a stronger hold, but it worked out. Now we want to take one of those cut off legs and trim it down so it just sticks out past the bar. We'll then put some glue on the end, and when we slide it into place at the center of the carb, we're going to rub some of that glue on the bar so it glues to the carb and the bar at the same time. Next, we're going to take some 30 gauge wire and we're going to strip off the insulation. We then want to wrap it around a sewing pin to form a spring. We want to keep the coils tight. We only need about 1/8 of an inch or so coiled up, but make sure to leave some wire on each end. This is going to be our return spring. Now we're going to form a loop on one end of the return spring, and we're going to glue that loop to the bit of paper clip sticking out in the middle of our throttle linkage. We then want to make a 90-degree bend at the other end near the front of the engine, and we're going to glue this end down between the intake manifold and the head. We could have drilled a hole and glued it in. Hindsight is 20/20. With as small as this is, I don't think it's going to be that noticeable. Now, I'm not great at throttle linkage, but we did give it a try. I've tried using the photo etch and it doesn't really work out that well for me either. Now for something beautiful that not even I can mess up, I bought some gorgeous turn metal pulleys from Mark over at Off the Sprue. He has all kinds of pulley setups, NASCAR, street car, Ford Coyote engines, all of them look stunning. Now the hole in the alternator was a little shallow and it was a little wide, so I want to go ahead and carefully drill in a hole for the pulley. We don't want to go through the other side though, so we want to be very careful. And we also need to drill a hole for the crank pulley. Now we're going to add a little glue into the opening for the alternator pulley, and we will use our rubber tweezers to put that pulley into place. Once again, these tweezers are awesome for things like this. The hole for the water pump is too big for the post on these pulleys. I could have and probably should have filled it and re-drilled the opening. I didn't think of it before I painted. Option 2 was to just glue the back of the pulley to the face of the water pump, and that worked out just fine. The last of our 3 pulleys is the crank pulley, and that went in without any problem at all. and those look freaking awesome. Like I said, guys, check out Market Off the Sprue. He has so much awesome stuff on his site, not just the pulleys. He's got all sorts of stuff. This pulley set comes with a little bit of rubber tube-like material to use for the belt. I'm going to put a little bit of glue on the bottom of the crank pulley where I thought it would be the least noticeable. I probably should have done this on one of the sides of the pulley. Then I'm going to go around the pulleys, adding a tiny dab of CA to each pulley to hold the rubber in place until it meets back at the first pulley. We're then going to cut the remaining material off, and we'll use a toothpick to press it flat while that glue sets. We have one thing left before we're done. The oil pan doesn't have a drain plug. We're going to use one of these 0.04 inch photo etch bolt heads from ProTech. They can be a little bit of a pain to get off the rubber backing, but once it's off, applying them is as easy as placing a tiny drop of CA on the oil pan and lifting the bolt head into place with a moistened toothpick. Just press that into place and we're almost done. What do I mean almost? I mean we're going to add a little bit of this dark brown Tamiya Panaline wash around that bolt head, and we're going to do this a couple of times. I kind of want to make sure that it runs down onto the oil pan, kind of like maybe there's a little bit of a drip from when we replaced the oil last time. A little bit of cleanup, but not too much cleanup, and now we're done. And that's going to be a wrap for the engine video. I had a lot of fun, guys. I hope you had a lot of fun as well. For those of you who made it this far, know that I appreciate you very much. I love the way this engine came out. All the little details really add up between the pulleys and the fuel rail and filter. I'm even pretty happy with that linkage. Our air filter comes off so we can see and display it at shows and whatnot. Everything, including the plug wires and the distributor, everything looks really clean. Check out my page on cults3d.com for all of my 3D printable designs, including these awesome valve covers. The link is in the description box below. And as always, guys, thanks for hanging out and building with me, and I will catch you on the next one.